The morning sun rose slowly over the green fields of Poland, but something huge was already moving. A river of soldiers, horses, and cannons stretched far into the distance. Flags waved high. Drums beat like thunder. It was the summer of 1812. And Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of the French, was beginning one of the most dangerous military campaigns in history. Over 600,000 men were marching east. They came from all over Europe, France, Italy, Germany, even Poland. They were called the Grande Armée, and their goal was simple: defeat Russia and force Tsar Alexander to obey Napoleon's will. But the soldiers didn't know what waited for them. Napoleon rode at the front, dressed in his usual gray coat. With a sharp look in his eyes, he had defeated many kings before. He had ruled most of Europe. He believed this would be another victory. He had planned everything, so he thought. His plan was to march fast, fight quickly, win a big battle, and force peace. But Russia was too big, too cold, and too clever for a quick war. As the French crossed the Niemen River, they left behind friendly lands and entered a quiet, unknown world. It was green at first, peaceful, too peaceful. The Russian army didn't fight. They kept falling back, burning everything behind them: farms, food, villages, even wells. The land turned empty and black. The soldiers began to whisper. Where is the enemy? Why are they running? Is this a trick? Days turned into weeks. The sun grew hotter. Dust covered the men's faces. Some soldiers collapsed from thirst. Some disappeared into the forests. Supplies were low, but Napoleon pushed forward. "We will reach Moscow," he told his commanders. "Then the Tsar will kneel." But the Tsar had no plans to kneel. He had plans to make Napoleon suffer. Soon hunger began to spread through the army like disease. The bread wagons fell behind. Horses died. Soldiers began eating wild berries, grass, and whatever animals they could catch. Some even stole from each other. Still, they marched on through burning towns and endless forests. Then, something strange happened. A Russian village was left untouched. Food was still on the tables. The French soldiers rushed in, hungry and happy. But the next morning, half of them were dead. Poison. It was a trap. The soldiers began to fear the land itself. "Even the water kills us," one whispered. "This place is cursed." Napoleon's generals started to worry. "We are too deep, too fast," one warned. "The Russians are drawing us into something." But Napoleon refused to stop. "We've come too far. The world is watching. If we turn back now, we lose everything." And so they marched deeper into the heart of Russia. The forests grew thicker. The roads turned to mud. Letters from home stopped arriving. Some soldiers didn't even know what day it was. Time felt broken. At night, the cold wind howled through their camps. Campfires were small, blankets were thin. And every time they looked back, they saw nothing but black smoke. The Russians had mastered the art of retreat. They gave up their cities, their homes even, their crops, just to deny Napoleon an easy victory. In one ruined village, a French soldier found a note carved into a wall. "You may take our land, but not our spirit." That note spread through the army like wildfire. Some laughed. Some grew angry. But deep inside, everyone began to feel that this was not a normal war. This was survival. Napoleon, sitting by candlelight in his mobile tent, stared at the map. Red pins showed how far they had come. But there were no signs of the Russian army, no main battle, no great moment of glory. He clenched his jaw. Where are they hiding? Then news came. The Russians had gathered at a city called Smolensk. Finally, a real battle. Napoleon smiled for the first time in days. "This is it," he whispered. "Prepare the men." But as they approached Smolensk, they saw something: shocking flames, smoke rising high into the sky. The Russians had set the city on fire and vanished again. No battle, no supplies, just ashes. That night, Napoleon stood in the ruins of a burned cathedral. His boots crushed the blackened stone floor. He looked around at the scorched walls and whispered, "What kind of people burn their own cities?" He had no idea. This was only the beginning because Moscow was still far ahead, and winter was waiting. The smell of smoke followed them now. It clung to their uniforms, their horses, even their dreams. Napoleon's army had crossed hundreds of miles, deeper into Russia, but all they ever found was fire and silence. They had expected parades, surrender, and songs of victory. What they found instead were burning cities and vanishing enemies. One morning, just past a ruined village, the ground trembled. Soldiers turned toward the horizon, but it wasn't the enemy. It was thousands of crows, flying low and circling something ahead. Their cries echoed like death itself. A French scout returned moments later, his face pale. "There's nothing left in the next town," he reported. "No people, no food, just bones." General Murat cursed under his breath. "How long can they run? There must be an end to this madness." Napoleon sat silently on his horse, eyes locked forward. He said nothing. But inside, he was starting to understand this war was unlike any he had fought before. The trap was clever, slow, and invisible. Each day, the Grande Armée pushed forward, chasing the ghost of the Russian army. But with each step, they lost. Something, a horse here, a wagon there, 100 men to fever, 1,000 more to starvation. The deeper they went, the smaller their strength became. They finally reached Smolensk, a proud city with tall walls and ancient churches. The French commanders prepared for a grand battle at last, a true fight. Cannon. Crews loaded their guns, flags rose high. Drummers beat the rhythm of war, but then, just like before, flames. The Russians set their own city on fire before running away. Entire neighborhoods exploded into fireballs. The sky turned black, even the rivers steamed. French soldiers watched in disbelief. Why would they destroy their own home? Are they insane? Whispered a Polish officer. They are Russian. Napoleon entered the smoldering city with narrowed eyes. This was not the victory he wanted. It smelled like loss, even though no battle had been fought. He walked past a church still burning. Its bell had melted and was now a twisted, useless lump of metal. A group of starving children stared at him through broken windows, their faces covered in ash. The emperor said softly, "They would rather destroy everything than let us have it." Napoleon still refused to turn back. His pride was his chinand. Now it was dragging his army deeper into a land that didn't want to be conquered. "March on," he ordered. "Moscow is near. The Tsar will come to his senses." But the Tsar wasn't planning to welcome him in the Russian camp far ahead. General Kutuzov stood near a fire, listening to scouts. His face was old, tired, but filled with something stronger. "Then hate-patience," one young soldier asked him. "Sir, why do we keep running?" Kutuzov placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "'Cause winter's coming, and when it does, the French won't be chasing us. They'll be praying we don't chase them." Back in Napoleon's army, things were falling apart. Horses were dying faster than they could be replaced. Many men had no boots. Some wrapped their feet in cloth and rope. Food was so rare, soldiers fought over dead rats. One man boiled his own leather belt just to chew something. Another was caught stealing from a burial cart. They didn't march like a great army anymore. They crawled forward, a skeleton of what they once were. Still, the officers kept shouting, "Courage! Moscow is close!" But in their eyes, even they didn't believe it. One evening, near a ruined farmhouse, a French soldier sat alone. His name was Armand. He had joined the army full of hope now. His fingers were frostbitten, and his stomach was empty. He looked up at the sky. It was purple and cold, like bruised skin. Then he saw something strange. A line of lights on the horizon like a burning necklace, stretching across the night. It was Moscow. They had reached it at last. But instead of cheers, the camp grew quiet, because if Smolensk was set on fire, what would Moscow look like? Night fell like a black curtain over the fields near Borodino. Strange silence covered the land, too quiet for two massive armies, sleeping just miles apart. A wolf howled in the dark. The French soldiers didn't speak much that evening. Sharpened their bayonets, cleaned their muskets, and looked at the stars. Some prayed. Others just stared. Everyone knew tomorrow would be different, because finally, after months of chasing shadows, Napoleon had found the Russian army standing. Still, this was it. The big battle. The moment the emperor had waited for, but no one expected the blood that would be spilled. No one could imagine that the very earth would turn red. Earlier that day, French scouts had reported a fortified Russian position near a village called Borodino. Behind ridges, trenches, and wooden barricades, General Kutuzov had set his trap. The French generals argued over the plan. Some said flank them, others said wait. Napoleon listened. Then he pointed straight ahead. We attack head-on, with everything. Battle of Borodino began on September 7, 1812. At dawn, first cannon fired and the roar never stopped for the next. 12 hours, smoke filled the sky like fog, drums pounded, men screamed, muskets fired again and again. The Great Redoubt, a hilltop fort, became the center of the storm. French soldiers charged it 3 times. It's time. Leaving behind piles of bodies, Russian cannons fired so fast they melted their barrels. Men fought with bayonets, shovels, even fists at one point. A Russian officer lit his gunpowder bag and ran into the enemy, choosing death over retreat. Napoleon watched the battlefield from a hill. He had a strange feeling in his chest. Pride, but dread. He could see thousands of his men falling. But still, he didn't send in his best reserve, the Imperial Guard. They are the last card, he said. We hold them back. Some believe if he had used them, he might have broken the Russian lines for good. But he hesitated, and in war, hesitation can cost everything. By nightfall, the battlefield was silent again. Not because the fight had ended, but because so many were dead or too wounded to move. Fires burned across the hills. Horses wandered with no riders. Bodies lay in thick layers, French, Russian, Polish, all mixed together. One French soldier named Lucien crawled through the mud looking for his brother. He didn't find him. Only his hat soaked in blood. He collapsed and cried, not from pain, but from emptiness. The numbers were shocking. Over 70,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. And the result? No clear winner. The Russians pulled back during the night, leaving the field to the French, but their army still lived. They could still fight again. Napoleon stood among the smoking ruins of Borodino and whispered, "One more victory like this, and I am ruined." He had won the ground, but at what cost? The next morning, the soldiers continued the march. But they didn't cheer, they didn't smile. They looked at each other with hollow eyes. "Is this what victory looks like?" one of them asked. Another replied, "If this is winning, I'd hate to see losing." As they moved on toward Moscow, many wondered if anything was left to take. The Russian army still lived. The Tsar had not surrendered. And behind them, winter was creeping in. Meanwhile, in the Russian camp, General Kutuzov sat with a cup of cold tea. He had lost many men, but he had also learned something. Napoleon bleeds, just like the rest of us, he said. And soon, he would bleed much more, because the next stop was Moscow. The Russians had no plans to save it. They had plans to burn it. It was too quiet when they arrived. No guards, no crowds, no celebration. It was cold wind blowing through the empty gates of Moscow. Napoleon stood at the city's edge with his commanders. He looked around in silence, waiting for anyone to meet him. He expected Russian officials. Maybe keys to the city. Maybe even a message from the Tsar, but nothing came. Only silence. And smoke. Faint, distant smoke. Something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. "This is not a victory," one officer muttered. "It feels like a graveyard." The Grande Armée entered Moscow. On September 14, 1812, it should have been a moment of glory. Napoleon had captured the capital of the Russian Empire. He had marched halfway across Europe to do it. His army had fought through hunger, fire, and blood to reach this point. But when they stepped into the city, they found a ghost town. Shops were locked. Homes were empty. Churches stood silent. Even the dogs had vanished. Then came the whisper from the locals who remained, "They left it for you to burn." That night, Napoleon set up headquarters in the Kremlin, the old fortress of Moscow. He looked out from a high window, watching the wind dance over rooftops. He thought the Tsar would send peace terms soon, but the Tsar did not send a letter. He sent flames suddenly. Fires erupted across the city, first in the north, then the east, and near the French supply stores. Within hours, Moscow was burning. The sky turned orange. The flames leapt from rooftop to rooftop, as if alive. French. Soldiers ran through the streets, trying to stop the fire, but water was nowhere to be found. Why? Because the Russians had cut the fire pumps and emptied the wells. It was not an accident. It was a plan. Russian saboteurs had stayed behind, hiding. In shadows, lighting fire after fire. They wanted the French to have nothing. By morning, a third of Moscow was ash. By the next night, over half was gone. Napoleon stood in the Kremlin, smoke curling around him. A wall nearby exploded from the heat. His guards begged him to leave, but he refused. "I will not run like they did," he said coldly. Yet even he knew the city was lost in the chaos. Some soldiers looted gold and art, others found barrels of wine and got drunk in the streets. But most sat quietly, staring at the fire with hollow eyes. One officer wrote in his journal, "We have captured a coffin. It shines like gold, but it is filled with death." Napoleon walked through the blackened ruins days later. The air stung his lungs. Dead horses lay in the streets. Walls cracked and collapsed as he passed. He reached a small chapel, half burned, and stopped inside. On the scorched wall was a single message scratched in charcoal. "Russia belongs to Russians, not to conquerors." He turned away. Weeks passed. Still no word from the Tsar, no peace offer, no surrender, only silence. In cold wind, Napoleon realized something terrible. He had won the city, but lost the war, because now there was nothing to eat. Winter was coming, and the enemy still lived. He called his generals. He gave the order, "Prepare to leave," but it was already too late. The fire had not only destroyed Moscow, it had destroyed their future. The snow came without warning, no storm clouds, no wind, just quiet white flakes falling over the burnt ruins of Moscow. One soldier reached out his hand and caught a snowflake. He stared at it. For the first time in the whole war, he looked. Truly afraid? "Winter," he whispered. "It has begun." Those around him didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They just stood still, because they all knew. The worst enemy was finally here. Napoleon had delayed too long. He waited weeks for a letter from the Tsar, believing peace would come. But no letter arrived. What did arrive was cold, endless, creeping cold. At first, it was only frost on the tents. Then, thin layers of ice in their drinking water. Then came the wind sharp as knives. Horses began to freeze standing up. Wagons cracked. Men's fingers turned black. The soldiers begged to leave. So finally, mid-October, Napoleon gave the order. We returned to France. But the retreat from Moscow was not a journey home. It was a journey through hell made of ice. They left the burning capital in columns marching west. They carried what little food was left, wrapped themselves in rugs and torn flags. They walked. Like shadows, some dragged wounded friends. Others sang to keep from crying. But the snow grew deeper. Russian Cossacks, light horsemen dressed in fur and armed with lances, appeared out of nowhere. They attacked the columns from the sides like wolves, then vanished. Every night, men died from the cold. Every morning, more were missing. In one village, the French found shelter in a barn. By dawn, half were dead inside from freezing. One French drummer boy, only 13, was found by his captain. The boy was curled under a dead horse, hugging its belly for warmth. The captain shook him. No response. The boy had frozen in his sleep, smiling. Napoleon, riding in a sled, tried to stay ahead of the disaster. But even he began to fear. He saw what was coming. Not just military defeat, but collapse at one river crossing. The real nightmare began. Ice cracked beneath the soldiers' boots. Cannon wheels froze in place. The Russians were closing in fast from behind. To escape, Napoleon ordered 2 bridges to be built. Under fire, in freezing water, men worked waist-deep in icy rivers, hammering wood, slipping on blood and snow. Thousands tried to cross at once. Many drowned. Others were crushed or pushed off the edges. One general called it a bridge of bodies. On the other side, Napoleon looked back. The flames from the last bridge lit the sky. Screams echoed from the far bank. He said nothing. Then he turned and rode on, from over 600,000 soldiers at the start. Now fewer than 30,000 remained. Some had been captured. Many had died, but most were simply gone, swallowed by the snow, forgotten by the road. By December, Napoleon knew he could not return with the army. He had to return alone. He boarded a small sled and raced back to Paris, disguised in a simple coat, leaving his broken army behind. When he arrived in France, the people were shocked. "How is the emperor here?" they asked. "Where is the army?" He answered only with silence. And in the east, snow continued to fall, covering the trail of bones, the broken flags, the burned dreams. The Russians had not needed to win a grand battle. They had simply waited for winter to fight for them. At first the road was white, then it turned red, then vanished under the bodies. The retreat from Moscow was no longer a march. It had become something else, a crawling line of ghosts, stumbling across snow-covered land that offered no mercy and no escape. There were no drums now, no orders, no banners. Only the sound of feet dragging, bones snapping, and the wind howling through empty trees like a dying scream. This was not war. This was slow death in motion. Each day began the same. The frozen bugle call, the groans of men waking up in ice, shaking hands trying to light small fires, the frost-covered corpses that would never wake again. Some soldiers refused to rise at all. They simply lay back down and closed their eyes. A strange peace came over them, right before the cold took their last breath. A general once said, "The snow is white, but it hides thousands of graves." The French had no food left. The bread wagons had long since vanished. Horses that didn't freeze were eaten. Even the leather straps from saddles were boiled and chewed like soup. Men fought over dead crows. One group even argued over the boots of a frozen comrade because they were still dry. Clothing was torn from the dead. Sometimes even before they died, the Russian Cossacks circled like wolves. They didn't always attack. Sometimes they just watched, waiting for the frost to finish their work. One soldier named Henry walked barefoot for 2 days. His boots had fallen apart. He rapped, his feet in old rags soaked in blood. When he could no longer feel his toes, he laughed quietly and said, "That's good. I feel nothing now." He didn't know that frostbite had already claimed his feet. He didn't walk the next day. There was no medicine, no hope. Even the commanders fell into silence. Some tore pages from maps to start fires. Others burned gunpowder. For warmth, the survivors were no longer soldiers. They were skeletons wrapped in rags. Still, they walked. They walked across frozen rivers, past burned towns, and through forests filled with wolves and echoes of the living dead. Every time someone coughed, others flinched. Disease spread faster than bullets. Napoleon was gone, he had fled. Weeks before, in a sled racing to save his empire, the men didn't curse him. They didn't even talk about him anymore. The emperor was a memory. What mattered now was one more step. One more fire. A Polish soldier named Tomasz found a child beside a dead woman in the snow. The child was Russian, alone, barely alive. Tomasz wrapped him in his coat and carried him for 3 days. On the 4th day, Tomasz collapsed. The boy survived. No one knew his name. But stories say he returned to that field years later. He cried for someone he'd never met again. By the time the retreat reached Vilnius, fewer than 10,000 men could still walk. The rest were dead, missing, or broken. Forever, The Grand Army that had once shaken Europe was now scattered bones beneath the snow. In Russia, people emerged from hiding. They saw the scorched cities, the empty fields, the silent churches. But they also saw something else. Russia still stood, and they knew. They had won without winning, because the land, the winter, and their will had defeated the greatest army the world had ever seen. When spring finally came, the snow melted slowly like the memory of a nightmare. Beneath it, the land revealed what winter had hidden. Helmets frozen in the ice, rusted swords sticking out of the mud, boot prints leading nowhere, and bones. Thousands of bones, the fields of Russia did not forget Napoleon's invasion. They held its remains. In France, the people waited for news. Months earlier, Napoleon had promised victory. He had promised Moscow. He had promised to return as the master of Europe. But now, there were rumors, whispers, questions. Where was the Grand Army? Why had letters stopped arriving? Why was the emperor back alone? Napoleon had returned to Paris secretly, wearing a simple coat and no crown. His face was thinner, his eyes darker. He told the people, "Everything is under control." But behind closed doors, even he knew the truth. His greatest mistake had begun to tear everything apart. Of the over 600,000 soldiers who marched into Russia, fewer than 10,000 returned. Some were broken, limping across the border like ghosts. Others came back without names, too wounded to speak. Many never came back at all. Fathers, sons, brothers. Gone. In Moscow, the Russians rebuilt what they had burned. Brick by brick, they raised their city again. Their churches rang louder. Their pride grew stronger. They had not defeated Napoleon in a single battle. They had defeated him with something greater: time, distance, fire, cold, and their refusal to kneel. The world watched in silence. Kings, who had once feared Napoleon, now saw a man who could bleed. His enemies began to rise again. They saw their chance to strike while he was weak. Austria, Prussia, Britain. Even his allies began to doubt him. Napoleon was no longer untouchable. He was human. Humans fall. In the years that followed, Napoleon tried to rebuild. He raised new armies, fought more battles. But Russia had changed everything. The myth of his power had been broken in the snow, and piece by piece. So was his empire. In 1814, just 2 years later, the unthinkable happened. Paris was captured, and Napoleon was forced to abdicate. He was exiled to a distant island, alone. The man who had once stood in the heart of Moscow with fire in his eyes, now stared at waves crashing against cold rocks. Years later, before his death, a visitor asked him what destroyed his army in Russia. Was it the Russian army? The cold? Bad luck? Napoleon answered only with this: pride. My greatest enemy was my own pride. Back in Russia, the people passed down stories of the invasion. They told their children about the man who came with the largest army in history, left with nothing. They remembered the fires, the silence, the endless white road, and they taught one simple truth: no matter how strong the enemy, a people who do not give up can never be truly defeated.